Whoops. Mute. Good evening. How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Tuesday, Yom Shlishi. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house? Still working with this new camera. Seems a little bit blown out. Sorry about that. Melissa in Great Neck, Yehud in South Carolina, Lucy in Minnesota, Bella in Florida, Renee in Indiana, Chaim in Florida, Frank in San Pedro, Lester in Florida, Moishi in Brooklyn, Nancy in North Carolina, Ella in Southern California, and Elise in Virginia. Welcome, everybody. I really should just not mess with it. Okay. Just deal with it. Okay. Here we go. Okay, opening tractate Menachos, the 30th volume of the Talmud. This one has 110 pages, so we've got about 17 months left. About 17 months left in our Daf Yomi journey, and this will be about 4 of them. And it is in many ways a continuation of the previous tractate. Zevachim was about slaughtered offerings. We also talked about bird offerings and meal offerings in passing, but now we're focusing a little bit more on meal offerings, right? So when the temple was standing in Jerusalem and offerings were brought, some of those offerings were in the form of flour, wheat flour, barley flour, sometimes mixed with oil, sometimes not, sometimes baked into loaves, sometimes not. But the opening of this tractate very much parallels the opening of tractate Zevachim, where a sin offering or a guilt offering or a peace offering or a burnt offering, what would result if the person slaughtering the offering or collecting the blood or conveying the blood to the altar or sprinkling the blood had in mind a different offering, either a different type of offering or the offering of a different owner. In most cases, it would remain qualified to finish its journey to the altar, but it would not satisfy the obligation of the owner, except in the case of the sin offering or the Pesach, in which case it would be, if it was brought for the wrong person or the wrong type of offering, fully disqualified, and it would not complete its journey even as a gift offering or some other kind of offering. Well, it's going to be a similar result here. The difference being that there are different kinds of meal offerings, and whereas all livestock offerings, right, sheep, goat, or ox, would have to be shechted, would have to be slaughtered with that sharp blade across the throat, etc., the lifeblood then collected in a service vessel. Here, the sort of operating, the main act that is done with the meal offering is the chametz, right, which was actually a somewhat complicated thing, required some manual dexterity of the Kohanim, the priests who would bring such an offering, to scoop out a certain amount of that flour with those three fingers, and then level it with the pinky and the thumb, something like that, and then place that flour in a service vessel. And then depending on how it was placed in the service vessel, how much oil was added, there are differences introduced. Whereas, when an animal was shechted, the blood was collected, the blood was conveyed, then the differences would be introduced at the time of sprinkling. There were different kinds of sprinkling. Okay, so let's get into it. Now, in this tractate, there's going to be a lot of technical material as well, like the last tractate, but there's also going to be quite a bit of interesting digressions. Okay, so we're page 2. All tractates in the Talmud begin on page 2. Mishnah number 1 of chapter 1. When one brings a meal offering to the temple, the priest removes a handful from it, places the handful into a service vessel, conveys it to the altar, and then he burns that flour, or however form it's going to take, on the fire that's on the top of the altar. And at that point, the remainder is permitted to the priests for consumption, and the owner has fulfilled his obligation. In this context, this Mishnah teaches, all the meal offerings from which a handful was removed, not for their sake, but for the sake of another meal offering, are fit for sacrifice, but these offerings did not satisfy the obligation of the owner, who must therefore bring another offering. If he vowed to bring an offering, or if he was obligated to bring an offering for some reason, he has not fulfilled that obligation. He's going to have to bring another offering. He's going to get credited for bringing an offering in the sense that this offering that was messed up because the priest had the wrong intention at the time that he was performing the ritual, has now caused the owner not to fulfill the obligation for which he was bringing a meal offering, but the owner will get credited for bringing an offering. It's just not the offering he was obligated to bring. He still has to bring that. This is the law with regard to all meal offerings, except for the meal offering of a sinner. So this is like the sin offering when we're talking about a shechted offering, an animal offering. And there were certain sin offerings that were variable, meaning that a rich person would bring a sheep or a goat. A sort of moderately wealthy person, a person of moderate means, would bring birds. And then a poor person had the option to bring a meal offering in order to satisfy his obligation to bring a sin offering. A sin offering is in a situation where if there's a prohibition in the Torah, and if you violated it intentionally, you would be subject to kares, excision, death at the hands of the heavenly court. If you did it unwittingly, you would become obligated to bring a sin offering. So when the temple is standing in Jerusalem and somebody violates unwittingly prohibition in the Torah of this sort, then he becomes obligated to bring a sin offering. So that's why if you brought a sin offering and somehow the priest messed up, and now because he sacrificed it or removed the handful in the case of a meal offering, not for its sake, right now you have not fulfilled your obligation. Now in the case of a sin offering, even of a meal offering, like the sin offering of an animal, if it's brought not for its sake, it becomes fully disqualified. You're not getting credit for any offering because this offering is not going to the altar. It's fully disqualified. And this idea of becoming fully disqualified and not completing its journey to the altar and the owner not getting credit for any kind of offering also applies to the meal offering of jealousy. This is part of the sota ritual, right? The suspected adulteress, which is brought as part of the rite of the woman suspected by her husband of having been unfaithful, the sota. In those cases, if the priest removed the handful not for its own sake, the offering is disqualified. With regard to the meal offering of a sinner and the meal offering of jealousy from which the priest removed a handful not for their sake, or where he placed a handful from them in a vessel, or conveyed the handful to the altar, or burned the handful on the altar, and during any one of those aspects, steps in the procedure of bringing a meal offering, he did it not for their sake, or he did it for their sake and not for their sake, or he did it not for their sake and for their sake. In all these cases, they are disqualified, right? So the Gemara will explain what the Mishnah is saying here. But if he did it not for their sake, that's case one, or case two, for their sake and not for their sake, or case three, not for their sake and for their sake, in all three of those, it's disqualified if it was a meal offering of a sinner or a meal offering of jealousy, fully disqualified. They don't get credit for anything. We don't complete the journey, and they're going to have to bring another offering. Now, the Mishnah elaborates, how are these rites performed for their sake and not for their sake? Well, this is in a case where one removed the handful with two intentions. Somehow he had two intentions in mind. For the sake of the meal offering of a sinner, meaning he had the correct intention, but then he also had for the sake of a voluntary meal offering, which is some other meal offering, and therefore he had two intentions in mind, one correct and one incorrect, presumably in that order, and that's going to disqualify it. And how are these rites performed? Not for their sake and for their sake. This is a case where one removed a handful with two intentions. First, for the sake of a voluntary meal offering, which is a different offering, and then for the sake of the meal offering of a sinner, which is the correct intention, the correct kind of offering. But now that he's already had an incorrect intention, it's going to be disqualified. That's Mishnah 1. Now the Gemara. The Mishnah teaches, all the meal offerings from which a handful was removed, not for their sake, but for the sake of another meal offering, are fit for sacrifice, but these offerings did not satisfy the obligation of the owner. And the Gemara asks, why do I need the Mishnah to teach, but these offerings did not satisfy the obligation of the owner? Now, what they're going into here is a specific nuance. Not why did it teach that they don't sacrifice, that they don't fulfill the obligation of the owner. We know that. What the Gemara is asking is, why was it worded like this? But these offerings remain qualified, but do not fulfill the obligation of the owner, is how it could have been worded. And instead it was worded, these offerings do not, these offerings remain qualified, but they do not fulfill the obligation of the, or these do not fulfill the obligation of the owner. There's an extra pronoun there that was unnecessary. We've already introduced the subject of the sentence. It could have had two verbs. By bringing the pronoun in the second time, what was added? That's what they're saying. Okay, that's the question that is being asked. Why do I need the Mishnah to teach, but these offerings did not satisfy the obligation? Ella shelo. Let it teach simply, velo. And it did not satisfy the obligation of the owner. What does the word ella, these, add? So the Gemara responds, by adding this word, the Mishnah teaches us that the only deficiency of these offerings is that they did not satisfy the obligation of the owner, But the meal offering itself is valid, and it is still prohibited to deviate from the protocol of its sacrificial process. So basically what they're saying is, let's say that, you, I'm not a priest, I'm not a Cohen, but let's pretend I am for a second. So you brought me a meal offering and said, Sal, you're a Cohen, please bring this meal offering on my behalf. I vowed to bring a meal offering to the Holy Temple. This is what I can afford to give. I want to make a gift to God. I'm a poor person. So I vowed to bring an offering. And here is my offering. Please bring it for me. Right? And so then I got you. I'll take care of it. Then I got distracted. I had so much going on that day. It was crazy. And at the time that I remove the handful from the flour that you gave me, I had something else in mind. Either I thought that you had to bring a sin offering, or, you gave me a meal offering and Mary gave me a meal offering. And I had Mary's meal offering in mind when I did this. And then I remember that I did that. Oh, I messed up, right? I messed up your meal offering. Okay, but it wasn't a sin offering that you were bringing. So it remains qualified. I now need to go through the procedures to bring your meal offering. You won't get credit for fulfilling your vow, but I still have to have the correct intention for the remaining steps of the process. I can't just say, okay, I had in mind to bring Mary's offering. Well, you know what? I'll just finish this as Mary's offering, and then I'll take Mary's offering and bring it on behalf of you. No. I can't do that. I messed up your offering by having the incorrect intention here, but I need to have the correct intention to bring your offering for the rest of the steps of this particular offering. Then I'll report back to you, I messed up. You do get credit for bringing a gift offering. It's as if you brought an offering. Very nice. But the one that you vowed to bring, you still have to bring another one. You're going to have to give me another quantity of flour for me to do that for you. I can't, because I had a wrong intention for removing the chametz, the handful. I still have to go back and have the correct intention for the rest of the steps. For example, if a handful was removed from a meal offering not for its sake, it is prohibited to also burn it not for its own sake. This law is in accordance with the statement of Rava. As Rava says with regard to a burnt offering that one slaughtered not for its own sake, it is still prohibited to sprinkle its blood on the altar, not for its own sake. Right? I have to go return back to the original intention. If I realize I've made the mistake, I need to correct that mistake, even though I'm not going to be able to correct it so much as to allow you to fulfill your obligation. You're still going to have to bring another offering, but the rest of the steps I have to do correctly. The Gemara adds, and if you wish, propose a logical argument to support this statement, and if you wish, cite a verse as proof of this law. And the Gemara explains, if you wish, propose a logical argument. Just because one deviated from protocol in its sacrifice once by removing the handful, could it be that he should continue to deviate from protocol in all the rest of the sacrificial rites? One deviation does not justify additional deviations. Now, I must say, here we can take a step back for 1 second and say, this is a really wonderful, practical teaching for our lives. Well, sorry. Once you make a mistake, don't compound the mistake. I think I might have said this when we started the last track day. But, you made a wrong turn. Don't think, oh, maybe I'm going to discover a new shortcut. I'll just keep going in the wrong direction. And maybe I'm going to end up discovering a new shortcut I never knew before. No, better turn around, go back to the place where you made a wrong turn and get back on the right road, right? Don't compound the mistakes. And if you wish, cite a verse to prove this law. quote, that which has gone out of your lips you shall observe and do according to that which you have vowed as a gift offering to the Lord your God, that which you have promised with your mouth. That's Deuteronomy 23:24. And what we are meant to notice about that verse is that we're talking about vows, right? That which you vowed you will do. But then in the second part of the verse, it talks about gift offerings. A gift offering is different than a vow. So why does the terminology switch from vow to gift? The Gemara analyzes this verse. Is it a gift offering? It is a vow offering. Why does the verse call it a vow? First call it a vow offering and subsequently call it a gift offering. Now, the difference between a vow offering and a gift offering is similar to consecrating a particular sheep or just vowing to bring a sheep, right? So one who vows to bring an offering. So if, for example, I said, I vow, bli neder, I'm not saying this, but if a person said he vows to bring a sheep, then he designates a sheep to be his vow, to fulfill his vow offering, then if he loses that sheep, he has to get another sheep to replace the first one in order to fulfill his vow, because he vowed to bring a sheep. On the other hand, a gift offering refers to a person who designates this particular sheep to be an offering. Therefore, that sheep is now consecrated, just like in the first case. But if he loses that sheep, he's done. It was only that sheep that he consecrated to bring as a gift. So if that sheep, gets lost or blemished or torn or eaten by a wolf or something, he doesn't have to bring another one. So a vow, he owes a sheep. He designates a sheep to fulfill it. He's going to have to replace it if that sheep gets lost. A gift, he consecrates a sheep to be the gift. If it gets lost, he doesn't have to replace it. Okay? So that's the difference here between vow offerings and gift offerings. Why did our verse switch terminology from vow to gift? The Gemara says, right, is it a gift offering? It is a vow offering. Why does the verse first call it a vow offering and subsequently call it a gift offering? This verse teaches that if you acted in accordance with how you vowed, i.e. if you sacrifice the offering for its own sake, then your obligation will fulfill your vow. But if you did not act in accordance with your vow, right, because something went wrong and you sacrificed not for its sake, you had some other offering in mind, then it will be switched to a gift offering. It's still nice to bring a gift offering, but you didn't fulfill your vow. Now we're on page 2b. The Gemara concludes the proof from the verse, and with regard to a gift offering, is it permitted to deviate from its protocol ab initio? Clearly, one may not do so. Accordingly, if one of the sacrificial rites of a meal offering was performed for the sake of a different meal offering, it is still prohibited to perform any of its other sacrificial rites improperly. You started down the wrong path, you need to get back on the path you were originally on. You don't keep going down the wrong path. Next topic. The Mishna teaches that all the meal offerings from which a handful was removed, not for their sake, are fit for sacrifice, but they do not fulfill the obligation of the owner. And the Gemara suggests, let us say that the Mishnah is not in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Shimon, as it is taught in a Baraisa that Rabbi Shimon says, all the meal offerings from which a handful were removed, not for their sake, are fit for sacrifice, and they even satisfy the obligation of the owner. Right? So this is the minority opinion of Rabbi Shimon, who seems to be quite a bit more easygoing, shall we say. He would have allowed this meal offering where the handful was taken not for its own sake. He said, no, it will fulfill the obligation of its owner, but we don't follow Rabbi Shimon. Now, the Baraisa continues, conversely, consecrated animals that were sacrificed not for their sake do not fulfill the obligation of the owner, as in this regard, meal offerings are not similar to slaughtered offerings. And the difference is that when one removes a handful from a type of meal offering known as a pan meal offering, right? It's made in a shallow pan. But he removed a handful with a different kind of meal offering in mind, namely a deep pan, okay, like Remember, like deep dish pizza and regular pizza, thin crust, thick crust. Okay, so there were different kinds of meal offerings. There was one that was a shallow pan. Some say the shallow pan was more like a griddle, like it had no edge, versus the deep pan, right, which had a surrounding rim. The point being that these are different kinds of meal offerings. So if one removes a handful from a shallow pan meal offering for the sake of a deep pan meal offering, its mode of preparation proves that it is in fact for the sake of a shallow pan offering, as the two offerings differ in appearance. And similarly, with regard to a dry meal offering, for example, the meal offering of a sinner, which contains no oil, whose handful is removed for the sake of a meal offering that is mixed with oil, its mode of preparation proves that it is for the sake of a dry meal offering, and one's improper intent is therefore disregarded. Right? Rabbi Shimon is saying, like, unlike animal offerings, where at the time of slaughter, no matter what kind of offering it is, you only know what kind of offering it is from the intention that the one slaughtering it has in his mind. Whereas these meal offerings, because they actually have different procedures, you might have had something else in mind, but the kind of offering you did proves what you were trying to do, and it won't matter what you had in your mind. We don't follow Rabbi Shimon, but that's his argument. You can see why it's pretty convincing. But with regard to slaughtered offerings, it is not so, as there is one manner of slaughter for all offerings, and one manner of sprinkling the blood for all offerings, and one manner of collection of the blood for all offerings. And since the differentiation between slaughtered offerings is established only through intention, one who sacrifices an animal offering not for its own sake does not fulfill the obligation of the owner. So Rabbi Shimon apparently disagrees with the Tana of our Mishnah here in Tractate Menachot on two counts. First, he claims that if the handful of a meal offering was removed not for its own sake, it nevertheless does satisfy the obligation of the owner, whereas the Mishnah taught that the obligation is not fulfilled. And secondly, Rabbi Shimon does not differentiate between the meal offering of a sinner or the meal offering of jealousy and the other types of meal offerings. He's saying no matter what kind of meal offering is being brought, intention won't matter because the way that you prepare it proves what kind of offering you were trying to bring. If you performed the wrong ritual, okay, well then you changed it. But the wrong intention in your mind won't be dispositive, according to Rabbi Shimon. Now, the Gemara comments, this works out well, i.e. the Mishnah can be explained in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Shimon, as the way that Rav Ashi explains the opinion of Rabbi Shimon. Rav Ashi says about Rabbi Shimon, on page 3b, he'll say this, in resolution of two apparently contradictory statements of Rabbi Shimon, that here, where Rabbi Shimon says that the meal offering is fit and fulfills the owner's obligation, he is referring to a case where one states that he is removing a handful from a shallow pan offering for the sake of a deep pan, i.e. he mentions only the vessel, not the type of meal offering. And conversely, there, where Rabbi Shimon says that the meal offering does not satisfy the owner's obligation, he is referring to a case where one states that he is removing a handful from a shallow pan offering for the sake of a deep pan meal offering. Right. So the difference is, again, it's very subtle. You have to listen so carefully. But in one case, he simply mentions that I'm using a shallow pan for a deep pan. And in the second case, he says I'm removing the flour from a shallow pan offering, but I'm doing it for the sake of a deep pan offering. Right? In that case, he's specifically saying that he's got the wrong intention, and that would disqualify it. Whereas in the first case, he just kind of mentioned some stuff that didn't quite make sense, and so that's not going to be enough to disqualify the offering. Accordingly, it can be explained that the Mishnah is referring to a case where one removes a handful from a meal offering for the sake of another meal offering, which is why it does not satisfy the obligation of the owner. But, wait a minute. Yeah. But according to the statements of Rabbah and Rava, who resolved that contradiction in a different manner, then what can be said? So the Gemara explains. And if you would say that the contradiction addressed by Rav Ashi is resolved as Rabbah answers, this is problematic. Rabbah resolved the contradiction as follows. And they're sort of speaking as if these sages have already spoken, even though what they're arguing on we haven't reached yet in our discussion. That's why it seems like, wait, what are they saying? Because they haven't said it yet, but we're assuming they have. Okay. So here, where Rabbi Shimon says that the meal offering satisfies the owner's obligation, he is referring to a change of sanctity, i.e., it was sacrificed for the sake of another type of meal offering. Whereas there, where Rabbi Shimon says that it does not fulfill the owner's obligation, he is referring to a change of owner, i.e., that he had in mind somebody else's meal offering, right? So it would still count, according to the minority opinion of Rabbi Shimon, if the priest is thinking about the same person, but he had in mind the wrong kind of meal offering. But if he did if he still did the right kind of pan, it's not going to change anything, and the offering is still qualified. But if the priest had in mind that he's bringing this meal offering on behalf of a different person, that would disqualify it, and there's going to be no more. It's certainly not going to fulfill the obligation of the owner. Now, the Gemara explains that the reason this explanation, this distinction in the opinions of Rabbi Shimon, the two opinions of Rabbi Shimon, which seem to contradict each other, and using this as the explanation, that in one case it would fulfill the obligation of the owner because it was just the wrong kind of offering, and in the other case it wouldn't fulfill the obligation of the owner because the priest had in mind a different owner. The reason that explanation of the contradiction between Rabbi Shimon's two statements, that this explanation is problematic, is what? Right? The Gemara explains that the reason this is problematic is that if one accepts Rabbah's resolution to the contradiction of Rabbi Shimon's two statements, then how can the Mishnah be explained in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Shimon? The Mishnah is clearly discussing the case of a change of sanctity, right? A different kind of offering. As it teaches, how are these rites performed for their sake and not for their sake? Whereby the offering does not satisfy the obligation of the owner. It is in a case where one initially removed the handful for the sake of the meal offering of a sinner, and then for the sake of a voluntary meal offering. This is a change involving a different type of meal offering, not a different owner. And alternatively, if you would say that the contradiction addressed by Rav Ashi is resolved as Rava answers, well, this is equally problematic. Rava resolved the contradiction as follows. Here, where Rabbi Shimon says that the meal offering satisfies the owner's obligation, he is referring to a case where one removes a handful from a meal offering for the sake of another meal offering, different type. Whereas there, where Rabbi Shimon says that it does not satisfy the owner's obligation, he's referring to a case where one removes a handful from a meal offering for the sake of a slaughtered offering. Now we're bringing in a totally different idea. In one case, it's a meal offering coming by itself, and in the other case, presumably it's a meal offering that was brought to accompany a slaughtered offering. And he had in mind that it was it wasn't its own meal offering, it was an accessory meal offering to a slaughtered offering. So the Gemara explains that if one accepts Rava's resolution, the Mishnah cannot be in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Shimon at all. Because the Mishnah is discussing a case where one removes a handful from a meal offering for the sake of another meal offering, as it teaches. How are these rites performed? Not for their sake and for their sake. It is in a case where one removed the handful for the sake of a voluntary meal offering and then for the sake of the meal offering of a sinner. And so the Gemara concludes, rather, according to the resolutions offered by Rabbah and Rava, it is clear that the Mishnah is not in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Shimon. In other words, no matter how you slice it, Rabbi Shimon's in the minority, and there's no interpretation of our Mishnah that would accord with the view of Rabbi Shimon. Next topic. The Gemara cites the Baraisa that we've been citing, right, without having right? The Gemara loves to do that. They throw you into the deep end of the pool. It would have been much easier to lay out all the fundamental, simple, this is a typical meal offering, and these are the steps of bringing it. This is another kind of meal offering, and these are the steps in bringing it. This is yet another type of meal offering, and these are the steps in bringing it. If you had in mind one kind of meal offering when you were supposed to be bringing another, it would be disqualified, and these are the reasons. Right? But we just jump right into the deep end of the pool and say, according to one view, it's disqualified fully, but you can't complete it. According to another view, it doesn't fulfill the obligation of the owner, but you can still bring it. But this accords with Rabbi Shimon in one respect and not with Rabbi Shimon in another respect, according to the interpretation of Rav, who argues with Rav Ashi, right into the deep end of the pool. That's how the Talmud works. Okay. So the Gemara cites the Baraisa that is the basis for the apparent contradiction between the statements of Rabbi Shimon, which was mentioned in the previous discussion. And a sage raises a contradiction from one statement of Rabbi Shimon and another statement of Rabbi Shimon. As it is taught in a Baraisa, Rabbi Shimon says that the verse written concerning the meal offering, it is most sacred as the sin offering and as the guilt offering. That's Leviticus 6:10. And this indicates that there are some meal offerings whose law is like that of a sin offering, and there are some whose law is like that of a guilt offering. Right? Now, generally speaking, the sin offering and the guilt offering are zevachim. Those are slaughtered offerings, right? A sheep, a goat, or an ox that are slaughtered. In some cases for a sin offering, right? And for a sin offering, I think it's a female sheep or goat in its first year. Guilt offering has a different identity for the animal, different requirements for the animal. But they have other implications. So how are meal offerings going to be likened to a sin offering or a guilt offering? Let us see. So Rabbi Shimon explains, the law with regard to the meal offering of a sinner is like that of a sin offering. Therefore, if one removed a handful from it, not for its own sake, it is disqualified, just like a sin offering that was slaughtered, not for its own sake. Conversely, the law with regard to a voluntary meal offering is like that of a guilt offering. Therefore, if one removed a handful from it, not for its own sake, it is valid. Like a guilt offering that was slaughtered not for its own sake, it's not going to fulfill the obligation to bring a guilt offering, but it's going to complete its journey to the altar and it will be credited to the owner as a gift offering. So Rabbi Shimon adds, and a voluntary meal offering is like a guilt offering in another respect as well. Just as a guilt offering is valid, but it does not affect acceptance, i.e. it does not satisfy the owner's obligation, so too a voluntary meal offering is valid, but it does not affect acceptance. So Rabbi Shimon here apparently contradicts his ruling that all meal offerings from which a handful was removed not for their sake nevertheless do satisfy the obligation of the owner. He just said that the meal offering of a sinner, if the handful was removed not for its sake, it's going to be like a sin offering, meaning disqualified, doesn't affect atonement, and is fully disqualified. But this contradicts where he said that no, if you took it out not for its own sake, it nevertheless does fulfill the obligation of the owner. So Rabbah said in resolution of this contradiction, this is not difficult. Here where Rabbi Shimon says that the meal offering does satisfy the owner's obligation, he is referring to a change of sanctity, i.e. it was sacrificed for the sake of another type of meal offering. Whereas there, where he says that it does not fulfill the owner's obligation, he is referring to a change of owner, i.e. the meal offering of Reuven was sacrificed for the sake of Shimon. The priest had in mind a different owner at the time that he was taking the handful. Abaye said to Rabbah, now, consider the fact that the merciful one disqualifies a meal offering due to improper intent, and this is derived from the Torah's comparison of meal offerings to sin offerings and guilt offerings. If so, What difference is there to me if there was a change of sanctity? And what difference to me if there was a change of owner? In the case of a guilt offering, either of these changes prevents it from satisfying the obligation of the owner. So why, when we switch it from animal offering to meal offering, are you going to say that if you had the wrong intention in mind in terms of type of offering, that it nevertheless will satisfy the obligation of the owner? That wouldn't be the case with an animal offering. So Rabbah said to Abaye, the claim that its mode of preparation proves one's intent, which Rabbi Shimon states in explanation of why offerings are disqualified through improper intent, is based on logical reasoning, as Rabbi Shimon interprets the reason behind the mitzvah in the verse and draws halakhic conclusions based on that interpretation. Right? He was saying that the type of meal offering, depending on whether it's a voluntary meal offering or the meal offering of a sinner, because there's a different process for how much flour you take and whether you mix it with oil or not, already tells you what kind of offering it is, and we remove the whole aspect of intention from it, at least with respect to intention between two different kinds of offerings for the same owner. You could have a mistaken intention with respect to the identity of the owner, which would disqualify the offering. But with respect to types of offering for the same owner, since there's a difference in how the flour is taken, that's different from slaughtered offerings where the manner of slaughter is the same, collecting the blood is the same, conveying the blood is the same. And even though sprinklings are done a little bit differently in terms of locations on the altar, the fact of sprinkling is the same. So, and remember that the first sprinkling affects acceptance anyway. So the sprinkling in the sense is the same. But with the meal offering, these actual physical differences in the procedure for Rabbi Shimon would take intention out of it with respect to the intention to bring one kind of offering or another for the same owner. And now Rabbah continues, and this is significant, as Rabbi Shimon holds that the merciful one disqualifies improper intent that is not recognizably false, i.e. when the intent is not in clear contradiction to the sacrificial rites performed. The intent to sacrifice an offering for the sake of another owner does not include a change in the sacrificial rites, and that's why it will disqualify the offering, because there the intention in the mind of the priest bringing the offering is super important. But that's as opposed to where the actual procedure of the offering is physically different, then intention won't matter. The merciful one does not disqualify improper intent that is recognizably false and contradicts the sacrificial rites performed. For example, if one removes a handful from a shallow pan meal offering for the sake of a deep pan meal offering, as the different substance itself indicates that this is a shallow pan offering. Now, the Gemara lists several questions with regard to Rabbah's statement, which provides a mnemonic for helping us to understand this argument, especially if we were going to memorize it. Burnt offering, pinched and squeezed, bird sin offering, offerings of the most sacred order, offerings of lesser sanctity. That's a little introduction to what we're about to discuss. Now, the Gemara first asks, but if that is so, that only intent that is not recognizably false disqualifies an offering, then in the case of a bird, burnt offering where one pinched the nape of its neck above the red line that divides the upper and lower halves of the altar for the sake of a bird sin offering, it should affect acceptance according to Rabbi Shimon. And the reason is that the actions performed on it prove that it is a bird burnt offering. Because if it is in fact a bird sin offering, he would have performed the pinching below the red line while standing beside the altar. And nevertheless, Rabbi Shimon agrees with the ruling of the Mishna in Tractate Zevachim, page 64b, that this bird offering does not satisfy the owner's obligation. But the Gemara rejects this line of reasoning. Is that to say that a case of a bird sin offering that is pinched above the red line is not possible? Did the masters say the pinching of a bird sin offering that is performed in any place on the altar is valid after the fact? Accordingly, there is no discernible difference between the pinching of a bird burnt offering and the pinching of a bird sin offering, so that the owner's obligation is not fulfilled. And so that, in other words, the analogy breaks down to this idea that with meal offerings, it's recognizable what he was trying to do by what he did, the action, because there are differences between the meal offerings. We tried to say, well, with, goats and sheep, etc., the slaughtering is all the same. But with bird offerings, there are differences in the procedure. And they say, yeah, but the differences are not as distinct as with meal offerings. And the Gemara raises another difficulty. If recognizably false intent does not disqualify an offering, then a bird burnt offering where a priest squeezed its blood above the red line for the sake of a bird sin offering should affect acceptance, as the actions performed on it prove that it is a bird burnt offering. And because if it is in fact a bird sin offering, he would have performed the required act of holding the body of the bird and sprinkling its blood below the red line instead of squeezing out its blood above that line. Again, a distinction in the actual procedure. Now we're on page 3a. And the Gemara responds, this is not considered a recognizably false intent. As people might say, perhaps it is actually a sin offering and he has already sprinkled its blood below the red line. And as for the fact that he squeezed its blood above the red line, they will say it is just a squeezing that follows sprinkling, which may be performed above the red line in the case of a sin offering. As the master said, if one squeezed the blood of a bird sin offering in any place on the altar, the offering is valid. Since people might erroneously think that this bird is actually a sin offering, this intent is not considered, quote, recognizably false. So the offering is disqualified. Again, there's more nuance and blurring of the lines between burnt and sin offerings when the offerings are being brought as birds than between voluntary offerings and the offering of a sinner when we're talking about meal offerings. The Gemara asks another question. According to Rabbah's resolution, a bird sin offering whose blood a priest sprinkled below the red line for the sake of a bird burnt offering should affect acceptance, as the actions performed on it prove that it is a bird sin offering, because if it is in fact a bird burnt offering, he would have performed it above the red line and he would have performed the act of squeezing instead of sprinkling. And the Gemara responds, indeed, according to Rabbi Shimon, such a bird offering does affect acceptance and it does fulfill the obligation of the owner. In fact, bird offerings were not discussed by Rabbi Shimon at all. Rather, he said because meal offerings are not similar to slaughtered offerings, which means that they are not similar to slaughtered offerings. And what are slaughtered offerings? Animal offerings. Sheep, goats, oxen. Not bird offerings, because bird offerings are not shechted. They are not slaughtered. When they are killed by the priest, it's a different procedure. Malika, pinching the neck. And that's why Rabbi Shimon never talked about bird offerings. He never said that meal offerings are similar or not similar to bird offerings. He only compared them to animal offerings. So the Gemara asks, well, but if so, then offerings of the most sacred order that one slaughtered in the northern part of the temple courtyard, which is a requirement that applies only to offerings of the most sacred order, sin offering, guilt offering, burnt offering, but not peace offering, thanks offering, free will offering, etc., which could be slaughtered in other parts of the courtyard. Right? So what applies here? Are they going to say, okay, but the slaughter, the actual cutting of the neck might always be the same, but the place in the courtyard is different. So if you had in mind to do a sin offering, but you did it in a different part of the courtyard, would we say that this is recognizably false? It does, so therefore it obviates having the wrong intention, and this is still going to fulfill the obligation of what it needed to bring a sin offering? That's what they're asking, and the answer is no, it doesn't. So doesn't that disprove Rabbi Shimon's contention with regard to meal offerings? But let's keep reading. Says the Gemara, but if so, then offerings of the most sacred order that one slaughtered in the northern part of the temple courtyard, which is a requirement that applies only to offerings of the most sacred order, but he slaughtered in another part of the courtyard, but he slaughtered in the north, but for the sake of offerings of lesser sanctity, then they should effect acceptance for their owners, as the actions performed on them prove that they are offerings of the most sacred order. Because if they are in fact offerings of lesser sanctity, he would have performed their slaughter in the southern part of the temple courtyard. And we're thinking, well, no. Offerings of the highest sanctity, they have to be brought in the northern part. Offerings of lesser sanctity can be brought anywhere. Right? The Gemara answers, the slaughter of an offering in the northern part of the temple courtyard is not indicative of the type of offering that one intends it to be. As one can say that the Merciful One states that offerings of lesser sanctity may be slaughtered even in the southern part of the courtyard. Did he say that these offerings must be slaughtered in the southern part and not in the northern part? No, if he slaughtered in the northern part, it's still valid for an offering of lesser sanctity. This is as we learned in a Mishna in Zevachim 55a, that the slaughter of offerings of lesser sanctity may be performed anywhere in the temple courtyard. Therefore, the fact that he did it in the north doesn't, make it recognizably false that he had the wrong kind of offering in mind. The Gemara asks, if so, then offerings of lesser sanctity that one slaughtered in the southern part of the temple courtyard for the sake of offerings of the most sacred order should effect acceptance for their owners, as the actions performed on them prove that they are offerings of lesser sanctity. Okay, maybe he had in mind that it was a sin offering when he was in fact bringing a peace offering, but since he slaughtered it in the south, it couldn't possibly be a sin offering. It would only be a peace offering or some other offering of lesser sanctity. Because if they are in fact offerings of the most sacred order, he would have performed their slaughter in the northern part. And the Gemara responds, the fact that an offering was slaughtered in the southern part of the temple is not a clear indication that it was intended to be an offering of lesser sanctity. As people might say, they are in fact offerings of the most sacred order, but the priest messed up. He transgressed the mitzvah to slaughter them in the northern part, and he slaughtered them in the southern part. We don't know that he meant to slaughter in the southern part. Maybe he messed up and he meant to do an offering the highest sanctity, and he just put it in the wrong place. The Gemara asks, well, if we're taking into consideration that he might have made a mistake, then, if so, i.e. if people might suspect an individual of performing the rite of an offering in an improper manner, well then, why don't we apply the same logic to meal offerings? Then if a priest removes a handful from a shallow pan offering for the sake of a deep pan offering as well, one who sees this, that this priest removes a handful for the sake of a deep pan offering, he might say to himself, hey, this owner took a vow to bring a meal offering in a deep pan, and as for the fact that he brings it in a shallow pan, it is actually the meal offering of a deep pan that the owner transgressed the mitzvah to bring it in a deep pan. And so he brought it in a shallow pan. Why then does Rabbi Shimon maintain that such an offering would satisfy the obligation of its owner? And the Gemara explains, there where the priest removed the handful from a shallow pan meal offering for the sake of a deep pan meal offering, even if the owner took a vow to bring a meal offering in a deep pan, when he brings it in a shallow pan, it is considered a valid shallow pan offering, and therefore the priest's intention is recognizably false. And this is as we learned in a Mishnah on page 102b of this tractate. This is as we will learn in 3 months. One who says, it is incumbent upon me to bring a meal offering prepared in a shallow pan, and he brought it in a deep pan. Or if he says, it is incumbent upon me to bring a meal offering prepared in a deep pan, and he brought it in a shallow pan, the meal offering that he brought, i.e. it is valid. And the priest performs the rite of the meal offering that he actually brought. But he did not fulfill the obligation resulting from his vow, and he must bring another meal offering to fulfill that obligation. Now, what's interesting about this is when you bring an animal, you hand over the animal. Now, a person could slaughter his own animal. The priest doesn't have to do the slaughter, but there does have to be a priest there to receive the blood. But distinguishing the offerings, the type of offerings, by bringing it in a shallow pan or a deep pan, seems to be something that the owner does. That part of it is not a mistake the priest made. That could be a mistake that the owner made. And then the priest just followed suit by what pan he was given. Let's keep reading. The Gemara asks, but even so, the priest's improper intent remains indiscernible, as people might think. Perhaps the owner said, this tenth of an ephah of flour is a meal offering that I must bring in a shallow pan, and in spite of this he brought it in a deep pan. Such a meal offering is disqualified and is not considered a valid shallow pan offering. As we learned in that same Mishna on page 102, one who took a vow, saying, this tenth of an ephah of flour is a meal offering that I must bring in a shallow pan, and he brought it in a deep pan, or if he vowed, this is the tenth of an ephah of flour, that is a meal offering that I must bring in a deep pan, but he brought it in a shallow pan, he, the owner, disqualified it, as he did not fulfill his vow. If so, how can Rabbi Shimon say that such a meal offering would satisfy the owner's obligation when the intent is not recognizably false? In other words, Rabbi Shimon has a minority opinion. They're trying to say, okay, well, from Rabbi Shimon's point of view, here's why he says it. And what they keep coming up with is, what's Rabbi Shimon talking about? His minority view doesn't make sense according to any possibility. So the Gemara responds, according to the rabbis, the majority, i.e. according to the opinion of the Mishnah that was just cited on page 102, there is indeed a difficulty. But according to Rabbi Shimon, there's no difficulty. Since with regard to a case where one took a vow saying it is incumbent upon me to bring a shallow pan meal offering, and then he brought it in a deep pan, Rabbi Shimon says, yeah, he has fulfilled even the obligation resulting from his vow. Evidently, the designation of the vessel for a meal offering is meaningless according to Rabbi Shimon. It doesn't matter whether he said shallow pan or deep pan. He pledged to bring a meal offering and he brought one, so he fulfilled his obligation. And there is no difference in this regard whether he said this is for a particular type of meal offering, and there's no difference whether he said it is incumbent upon me to bring a particular meal offering. In both instances, the unique actions of each particular meal offering prove its identity, and therefore the owner fulfills his obligation regardless of the priest's improper intent. So Rabbi Shimon is a little bit like at a poker game, the cards speak, right? Sometimes at a poker game, a guy is holding a full house. He doesn't notice he has a full house. He puts down his cards and he says, I have two pair. And with two pair, he loses. But his cards say he has a full house. So what matters? What he said or what the cards show? Rabbi Shimon would say what the cards show. He brought the kind of meal offering that is this kind of meal offering. There it is. The meal offering speaks for itself. But if he vowed to bring a different meal offering, according to the majority, no, disqualified. So the Gemara asks, if that is so, according to Rabbi Shimon, that in a case where the manner of its preparation proves the identity of an offering, the owner fulfills his obligation, then a burnt offering that one slaughtered for the sake of a sin offering should effect acceptance. Right? Why doesn't it? In other words, they're saying, well, then according to Rabbi Shimon, why doesn't he extend the same principle to animal offerings? His actions prove that it is a burnt offering. As this, a burnt offering is always male, and that, a sin offering, is female. And the Gemara answers, since there is one sin offering, the goat of the Nasi, which is male, it is unknown whether this animal was a burnt offering or the sin offering of the Nasi. As unusual as that offering might be, it still exists, and its gender is not conclusive proof of anything. So then the Gemara tries again and says, but in the case where one said, I am hereby slaughtering this animal for the sake of a sin offering of an individual, which is always female, then what can be said? Since a male animal cannot be mistaken for such a sin offering, why doesn't this burnt offering satisfy the obligation of the owner? And furthermore, a sin offering of an individual that one slaughtered for the sake of a burnt offering should effect acceptance, at least according to Rabbi Shimon, as such a sin offering is always female, and a burnt offering is always male. And the Gemara responds, it is difficult to discern whether a lamb is male or female, as its genitals are covered by its tail. Accordingly, its gender is not considered proof of the type of offering being sacrificed. It is not recognizably false that the animal would contradict his statement. So the Gemara asks, okay, this works out well in a case where one brought a female lamb as his sin offering, as its tail makes it difficult to determine its gender. But in the case where he brought a female goat, then what can be said? The goat doesn't have a tail that covers its genitals. Its gender is easily recognized. And the Gemara answers, well, rather, discerning between males and females is not on people's minds. They do not take notice of the offering's gender, and therefore this aspect of an animal is not considered obvious or easily discernible. I'm almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in now. The Gemara continues to challenge the opinion of Rabbah. A Pesach offering that one slaughtered for the sake of a guilt offering should effect acceptance, as this, the Pesach, is in its first year, and that, the guilt offering, is in its second. And the Gemara answers, since there are two guilt offerings that are brought from lambs in their first year, i.e. the guilt offering of a Nazir and the guilt offering of a Mitzorah, it is not definitively clear to an onlooker what type of offering this lamb is. Gemara asks, yeah, but if one said, I'm hereby slaughtering this lamb for the sake of a guilt offering for robbery, or if he said, I'm slaughtering it for the sake of a guilt offering for me'ilah, misuse of consecrated property, then what can be said? These guilt offerings must each be brought from an animal in its second year, and therefore they cannot be mistaken for a Pesach, which must be in its first year. And furthermore, a guilt offering for robbery or a guilt offering for me'ilah that one slaughtered for the sake of a Pesach should effect acceptance, as a Pesach is always in its first year, and these are in their second year, since it is clearly discernible what is being brought. The fact that you brought it for the wrong kind of offering should not disqualify it nor prevent you from fulfilling your obligation. And the Gemara challenges a goat that one slaughtered for the sake of a guilt offering should effect acceptance. It is clearly not a guilt offering, as this, a guilt offering, is a ram with white wool, and that, a goat, has black hair. And the Gemara responds, people will say that the goat is actually a black ram, and they may indeed mistake it for the guilt offering. So the Gemara tries again and says a calf or a bull that one slaughtered for the sake of a Pesach or a guilt offering should effect acceptance, because that's obvious. One is a sheep or a goat, the Pesach. The other is a bull or an ox, cow. That never is a Pesach. So if you say this is a Pesach, it's obviously false. The Gemara responds, yes, it is indeed so. As according to Rabbi Shimon, such offerings would affect acceptance for their owners because it speaks for itself. The mistake is too obvious for anyone to mistake it. And what does Rabbi Shimon mean when he says that meal offerings are not similar to slaughtered offerings? He means that they are not similar to most slaughtered offerings. There are, however, certain slaughtered offerings whose preparation, which is unique to that particular offering, is so obvious that it is proof that it is that offering. And in those instances, Rabbi Shimon does maintain that the offerings would fulfill the obligations of their respective owners despite the improper intent. And again, that is the minority opinion of Rabbi Shimon, and we don't hold by Rabbi Shimon. Okay, we're at the top of 3b. That's where we'll knock off. Just one comment from Bill. It seems to me that the strength of Rabbi Shimon's argument is that the intent of the Kohen is known only on the testimony of the Kohen himself. The intent, right, is only in his head, and that's why I think this. I think that the strength of Rabbi Shimon's argument, right, is like the cards speak for themselves. The offering speaks for itself, and maybe what you're saying, Bill, is, and that would remove the errors that are based on mental state. But there's too many problems introduced by let the offering speak for itself, because it's not always so clear what the offering is. That's what I've got for us tonight. With God's help, see you tomorrow, the regular Wednesday time, 6 p.m. Pacific. And let me mention that, and I'll mention it again tomorrow, but Thursday there's going to be no class because we have a family event for the Litvacs. Tomorrow, regular time. Thursday, no class. Have a good night.